So, hey guys, today I'm going to teach you guys how to cheat. And by cheat, I mean math. So, we can min-max math. So, I mean, having 100% accurate numbers is, of course, better and useful. But when it comes to Yu-Gi-Oh, just general estimations will do. So, today we'll just go over some basic concepts of kind of math, I suppose. So, if we look at our hand traps in this particular list, we'll notice we have Back Failure, 2 copies of Drone Lock, 3 copies of Ash Blossom Joy Spring, 3 Bestials. So if we look at all of these hand traps, that puts us to 9 different hand traps. And we can just assume they'll all be relevant because it'll be more convenient for our current calculations. So uh, just in general, cards, the odds of opening any individual card is around 10%. And the amount decreases if after a certain point, it's around something like 70 to 60%, maybe even closing around 80%, but around 60 to 70%, there is a fall off. So as long as we know that, then if we were just accounting for these 3 cards, there's a 30% chance to open these cards. If we account for uh, these 6, then that will be around 60 to 50%. So we could just say around 60% for our calculations. So, for example, if we just run these 6 cards, there's about a 40% chance we don't open any hand traps at all, 60% chance that we do open at least one of any hand trap. And these numbers you can just kind of remember, but in general, it's just 10% per card. You can think of it that way, decaying at around 6 copies, 7 copies, somewhere around there. And if we have 9 cards, of course, it won't be 90% chance for us to open. So let's see. Do we open a hand trap? Nope. So next one, we open 2 hand traps. This one hand trap. This, we open 2 hand traps. There's still a very decent chance of opening hand traps, of course, but it's not like 90%. It should still be like, around it should be like what, 73% or something like that, something relatively high. But yeah, about 1/3 of the time in this list, I might not see a hand trap at all. And actually, wait, I forgot about infinite impermanence. That's why it's so high. So it's actually probably closer to around 80% than yeah. So a little bit around 80%. And if you're thinking about consistency, then well, there's no solid way to really improve your consistency for your deck in terms of combo unless you completely drop hand traps. That's like a prerequisite to having 100% deck consistency. But of course, even with that deck consistency, it doesn't do anything for you going second because going first and combos, those are very, very powerful. So we'll just go over the basic idea of how you can technically achieve 100% consistency. So, well, to start, when you are at the start of any duel, I guess, you have 5 cards. So, a simple way to have 100% consistency is to make sure that you only have starters in your deck so that you have 100% consistency. And the limit for cards you have that are non-engine will be 4 cards because if you have 4 cards, it is literally impossible for you to not draw combo because you simply do not have enough cards in your deck that are not combo, where the majority of your deck is combo, if that makes sense. So let's say we have Called by the Grave, Triple Tactics, Thrust, Talents, and then 1 additional copy of Talents. Then we have still one space in our hand, and assuming the rest of our deck is literally just all starters, then we are literally guaranteed to always have combo. So that's how you would achieve 100%. You just need in the case you're playing a 40 card deck, you would have for every single deck really, you would have only for non-engine with, in this case, 36 engine, If we increase the numbers, it's still the same. You only have 4 non-engine slots. So if we go to 60 cards, then you would have 56 engine, and they all have to be essentially combo every single one of those 56 cards for you to never possibly be able to break. I mean, the odds would be relatively low, even with 5, because you have to open all 5 of those cards in the same hand, which is basically the same as hard opening Exodia. But, you know, it could technically happen if you care enough. But, yeah, odds of just opening certain hand, you can kind of manipulate it a little bit in deck building, like the type of hand you want, uh, how often you draw certain cards. You can manipulate that a little bit. So, for example, let's say I need to play Effect Failure for something. Maybe I want to play 2 copies of it then. And the reason for playing 2 copies of something is actually pretty interesting. So, the odds of opening a specific card in your hand is 1 in 10. So if we have 1 copy of, let's say, Drone Lockbird, I'll only see this 1 in 10 games, right? And this will apply to any Garnet as well. So let's say we're playing Geo. It doesn't really matter which we're playing, but Geo is specifically a card you need in the deck for your combo, right? And to make this really work out, we actually need to run, surprisingly, 2 copies of Geo, despite Geo being a completely terrible card to open in our hand. And the math for this is actually pretty solid. So the odds of opening Geo is 1 in 10. But the odds of opening both copies of Geo, since we have to account for each individual copy and not as a collective. So it's a 1 in 10 to open this copy, and also a 1 in 10 to actually open this copy, because although you're running 2 copies of Geo, these are like separate copies of Geo, if that makes sense. So the odds of opening this Geo, 10%, this one, also 10%, collectively to open any Geo is 20%. So if we kind of compound the probability here, the odds of opening both copies of Geo is going to be 1 in 100. So 1% odds of opening both. So if you needed just like a card in deck for something, so in this case, let's say we need Branded Fusion in deck for Verde Anaconda, having 2 copies of Branded Fusion would be a way to kind of make it less bad if you open Branded Fusion. But you still, of course, do not want to open Branded Fusion in this case, because it might do nothing in your deck. So, yeah, that's basically just some quick maths and some quick numbers. So, to summarize real quick, you can just, for estimating things on the fly, you can say about every single card is 10% odds of opening, and top decking is going to be a little bit different, but we can go over that if you guys want later. But yeah, 10% for just any card in your deck, falling off at around 7 copies, I believe. After that point, the probability starts going up a lot less, I guess. And then if we take 2 copies of a card, so in this case, let's say we only run 2 Bestials, the odds of opening both of them would be 1%. So if we're looking for a specific hand, it's much harder to do. If we're going by like card category, like opening a hand trap versus opening this specific hand trap, it's going to be quite a bit different. So opening Infinite Impermanence, 30% chance to open a single copy. If I want to open 2 copies, then I believe the odds are really low. I don't know exactly how low, but should be around like what, 2% or 3% or something like that, even with 3 copies, I believe. So not gonna happen that often, but it's not, well, maybe it's even as high as 5%, because I'm just like estimating. I'm not actually doing the calculations, but just with rough numbers, you can have a good idea of what to do sometimes. So I'll give an example. So if we're playing against Blue Eyes, well, without even doing the calcs before the duel, because that is also another thing you can do to help with decision making before the duel happens, and that will save you time during the actual duel. If you already know the correct answer or what you should do in certain situations, then you can just make the action. You don't have to think about it. But all right, so we have normal summon Sage with Eyes of Blue. Then the follow up to Sage with Eyes of Blue is going to be Maiden of White, or you have Wishes for Eyes of Blue. So these are the two major follow ups for Sage with Eyes of Blue. If this is the Blue Eye starter, right? So before, we'll go with the before numbers. You had 3 copies of Maiden and then 3 copies of Wishes. So if your opponent were to have Wishes for Eyes of Blue or Maiden of White, which gets you into Wishes for Eyes of Blue, what are the odds of your opponent having this with Sage with Eyes of Blue? So we already know they have Sage with Eyes of Blue because we're assuming they're normal summoning it. And let's say you have Ash Blossom Joy Spring here, or maybe Infinite Impermanence. It doesn't really matter. You have something to stop Sage with Eyes of Blue. So do we or do we not hit Sage with Eyes of Blue? So we know that they only have 4 cards in hand because they have Sage with Eyes of Blue as one of their cards here. So we can just do the estimation using these cards. So we have 3 Maidens, 3 Wishes for Eyes of Blue. So about 10% chance to open each of these individual cards, kinda. And then if we kind of like combine them and kind of like compound the percentages, this will be around 60% odds of opening one of these cards. But since we do know that they have a Sage with Eyes of Blue, instead of the usual 5 cards, this will be 4 cards. So the odds will be slightly lower because they did have Sage with Eyes of Blue. And technically only 4 of their 5 cards in hand can be Maiden, if that makes sense. But we can still use around the 60% number, and instead we'll just think of it as, well, a 50-50, because that'd be a little bit easier, and it's not too far off the estimate. So there's about a coin flip's chance that your opponent has Maiden of White or Wishes for Eyes of Blue as follow-up. So here, using Ash Blossom Joy Spring is reasonable. Not using it against Sage with Eyes of Blue is also reasonable. And if you were to impermit, that is also fairly reasonable. And yeah, I mean, that's just some quick maths right there. So if we do have Maiden of White, we can also account for that with the Primate cards, depending on what your opponent starts with. So if we normal summon Etherburl, what are the odds that your opponent has a Sage with Eyes of Blue or a Maiden of White? So Sage with Eyes of Blue can also be searched with Wishes for Eyes of Blue, and then you can go like Sage grabs Maiden, and then send Maiden or True Light. Or you can go like Maiden, Wishes, grab Sage. So the odds of your opponent having Sage, it's going to be around something like 70 to 80%. So they basically pretty much, I guess you'd think of it as they pretty much always have Sage. But if you actually have Ash Blossom Joy Spring, then the choke point is going to be Wishes for Eyes of Blue. So even though we have like a 60% chance to additionally get Sage if they did not open Sage, ashing on Wishes or Maiden going True Light, and then you ash that Wishes, it's kind of all same, and then they'll only have, like, let's say a 30% chance to have a access to Sage. But then you also have to consider, of course, like, if your opponent has Called by the Grave, then your ash doesn't matter, and that's also something you can factor in, and that's a 10% chance of opening Called by the Grave. So you can just factor that in as well as an additional 10% and slap that with the rest. So let's say generally 70% chance of your opponent having some access to Sage or being able to resolve Sage. however you want to think of it as. But yeah, just some quick math trickery to help you kind of do some decision making. And of course, it does help to know in general what your opponent's deck list will look like or what certain archetypes have as ratios to do these calcs, which this doesn't fully help you with, but I mean, that's what having another tab is for, I suppose. That or just learning the ratios ahead of time, just at least kind of looking at what cards are played with like whatever meta archetype is just worthwhile, even if you don't like. Well, I guess reading cards ahead of time will save you time during the duel as well. So yeah, I guess it's really worth doing. So yeah, that's all I got for you guys today, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Bye.